Okay, we're recording. Baruch Hashem. Everyone, please turn off your microphones so that we don't hear the background noise because it's a special evening for us. We've been waiting kind of a long time for this, and I'm excited to present Joan Schwartz, who's going to be giving over the story of her mother, Eva Herzberg Schwartz. She was a German Jewish refugee, and her talk includes a PowerPoint, which I'm going to be running the slides, and she's going to be telling me what to do. And we're going to be seeing a lot of pictures and hearing a lot of stories about this remarkable woman who luckily avoided being slaughtered with the rest of the 6 million Jews and during the Holocaust, and somehow made her way to a different life. And Baruch Hashem that happened, obviously, because we wouldn't have Joan with us, not to mention all sorts of other people as well. So Joan, we're really pleased to have you with us. Welcome. And I'm going to also spotlight you so that when you're speaking, people will, whoops, why am I spotlighted? That's not right. No, you're spotlighted. Okay, and just let me know, I'm going to start should I start the screen share with the PowerPoint now?
Yeah, with the very first one. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Joan Schwartz. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've led groups for adult sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors. So this is the title of my talk. I'm going to talk about my mother, Eva Herzberg Schwartz, who was born in Trier, Germany on May 10th, 1921, into a Jewish family. Due to Nazi persecution, she and her parents immigrated to the San Francisco Bay Area in October 1937 when she was 16. She lived in the Bay Area until 1946 when she married my father, Isidore Henry Schwartz, and moved to San Diego with him. She had a career as a lab technician and a college chemistry instructor. She and my father raised 4 daughters. My mother died on February 8th, 2015, at the age of 93. So this presentation is part of her yahrzeit. In this talk, I'm going to discuss the history of Trier and its Jews and the history of my mother's family in Germany. Then I'll talk about my mother's experience living in Germany, both before and during the Nazi era. Then I'll discuss her experience living in California. And finally, I'll talk about how I was affected by having family members who experienced and survived the Holocaust. After I finish my presentation, which will take about 45 minutes, we'll have time for discussion. If you have questions during the presentation, you can enter them in chat or ask them in the discussion period. Next slide. My sources for this talk are an elaborate family tree produced by my mother. This is a copy of it. She did it by hand. And my mother's 78-page handwritten autobiography, and my own experiences with my mother, including a visit to Trier with her in 1984 to celebrate the town's 2000th anniversary. Next slide. I will also refer to 3 books and 2 newspaper articles. So I will start with the history of Trier. Next slide. Trier is on the Mosel River, which is a tributary of the Rhine River. And you can see it here on the map of Germany. And it's very near Luxembourg. So it's in southwestern Germany. It is famous for producing Moselle wine. It's sort of the Napa Valley of Germany, and for its Roman ruins, and for being the oldest town in Germany. My mother began her autobiography saying, and I'm going to quote directly from her for a lot of this, "On New Year's Day, 1979, my daughter Joan suggested that I write an account of my life and family background so that she and her sisters would know something about their own maternal background. I was born and raised in Trier on the Mosel River. Trier was proud of being an ancient city. On the building of the Steipe, a medieval burgher's house on the main market square, there was an inscription in Latin which meant Trier is said to have been standing 1,300 years before Rome. Trier was a Gallic settlement which the Romans took over and made into the capital of their Western Empire in the 3rd century AD. Still standing are remnants of ruins of Roman baths in the Porta Nigra, the Black Gate, a part of the fortified Roman wall. Eventually, Trier became the seat of an elector of the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The last Archbishop Elector was Clemens Wenceslaus, the son of Empress Maria Theresa. A document with his signature hangs on the wall behind my fireplace. This is my mother speaking. This document is a residence permit for a certain Jew, Loeb Lazarus, and his immediate family. I also have a painting of Mr. Lazarus on glass hanging there. I have these things because 2 of his descendants were patients of my grandfather, who was a doctor. I hung them in my living room to remind myself of the fact that I came from a place where formerly Jews needed a special permit just to live. And of course, I left Trier because in my day, Jews could not live there anymore under any circumstances. Next slide. In the Napoleonic Wars, Trier was ruled by the French for a while. Then they left, and these are the ruins here on the left, the Roman baths in Trier. And then this is the Löwenstein family. The girl on the right is my grandmother, Charlotte Löwenstein, her mother, Hedwig Isai Löwenstein, her father, Dr. Louis Löwenstein, and her brother, Max. When the French left, Trier became part of the state of Prussia, and after 1871, part of the German Reich. After the First World War, French soldiers occupied Trier. When they left, it did not take long before the Nazis brought German army units back into the Rhineland in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Between the quick steps of the marching Frenchmen and their tinny band music and the strutting of the Nazi troops and their rabble-rousing songs and the rolling of German armored trucks over the pavements of Trier, not much time elapsed. An article in the New York Times dated February 15th, 2015 stated that the first victims of the First Crusade in 1096 were European Jews. The city of Trier on the Mosel River was one of the early stops. The Crusaders killed Jews who would not agree to conversion to Christianity or exile. My mother wrote, "The Jewish community of Trier was old, probably going back to Roman times. In the Middle Ages, they were herded into a ghetto, a Jews' lane that ended up at a gate near the main market square, which was closed at nightfall. In the 1820s, Karl Marx was born in Trier. Marx's birthplace, the family home, was renovated in the 1920s by a friend of ours, Mr. Castle, and was used by the Social Democratic Party as party headquarters. When the Nazis came, they made it into the Brown House, or party headquarters. Today it houses the Karl Marx Museum, which we visited in 1969. In his book, The Pity of It All, Amos Alone wrote, Karl Marx was a scion in a family of Jewish rabbis. However, in 1824, when he was 6 years old, his family converted to Protestant Christianity, but continued to have Sabbath meals with his uncle, the chief rabbi of Trier. And so I want to show, we already looked at the family tree, which my mother constructed on the basis of interviewing her mother and looking at records and family Bibles. And the next slide, the family tree lists Judah Meyer, 1770 to 1860, as its oldest known ancestor. It also lists Hilda Isai Hubbuck, and there should be a slide of her. She's on the left in 1928. She's my mother's grandmother's first cousin. She studied at a famous art school, the Bauhaus in Germany, and became a children's photographer in New York. My grandmother's cousin, Helena Breslau, married a famous doctor and theologian, Albert Schweitzer. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952 for his work founding and operating a hospital in Africa. And the picture on the right, Lotte Herzberg, is my grandmother. My mother wrote, many of the Rhineland Jews lived in smaller towns and villages. According to our family records, my ancestors were among them. My father's family came from Westphalia on his father's side and from the vicinity of Cologne on his mother's side. His father, Louis Herzberg, was one of 9 children. and dealt in real estate and mortgages. He married Ottilia Salomon from Munz, which was near Cologne. They lived in Düren and Cologne and had 6 children, of whom three survived to maturity. Next slide. My father, Gustav Herzberg, was born on April 1st, 1882. He is on the right with his violin, and that is his string quartet. And I actually, for a while, played on his violin in beginning orchestra in 7th grade until another kid bashed a music stand into it. My mother got really mad. And after that, I had a school violin. Anyway, back to my grandfather, Gustav Herzberg. His sister Sophie was born in 1879, and his brother Berthold was born in 1886. My father and his brother served in the German army in World War I. His brother Berthold was wounded at the front in the war, lost a leg, and died on September 27, 1919. Sophie became a piano teacher and accompanist and married an engineer named David Blumenthal. They had 3 sons and moved to Spain, where Mr. Blumenthal changed his name to Ferdinand and became a Protestant Christian. Later, they moved to Oakland, California, and he changed his name to Ferdinand Bell. Their son, Robert Bell, gave the affidavit of support that brought us to the United States. On my mother's side, the family had lived in Trier or Cochem or Schweiz on the Mosel. My mother's father, Louis Levenstein, or later Ludwig, was the son of a small shopkeeper in Trier. He was a doctor and became chief of staff at the Protestant hospital. He and my grandmother, Hedwig Isai Löwenstein, had 2 children. My mother, Charlotte, known as Lotte, was born in 1892. Her brother, Max, was born in 1896. After World War I ended, my father, this is my mother speaking, was dismissed from the army as a subaltern with an Iron Cross 2nd class. He strung telegraph wires when he was in the army and later studied chemistry at the university in Heidelberg. After graduating, he found a job as a wine chemist in a champagne factory run by Mr. Adolf Wagner in Trier. For his social life, he found some people who enjoyed chamber music and played quartets in which he participated as a violinist, as we can see. There he met my mother, who had been a Red Cross nurse in World War I. After a brief courtship, they became engaged and got married on November 9th, 1919. They moved into a rented flat on Saarstrasse, a couple of doors down from my grandparents' house. Next slide. On May 10th, 1921, I was born in the flat on Saarstrasse. And this is a picture of my mother as a baby with her parents, Lotte and Gustav Herzberg. And this is a picture of my mother as a young girl. She looks very cute. Shortly after I was born, my mother got quite sick. Fortunately, she and I were well looked after by wonderful maid Kätzchen. When I was less than 3 years old, we moved to 13 Strasse, a house owned by my grandparents who lived on the middle floor. My grandfather's medical office was on the 1st floor. We lived on the 3rd floor. I remember that when I lived up there, I was so little that I required a guardrail at the side of my bed to keep me from falling out. I shared a rear bedroom with our maid. I was very much attached to my toys, 2 little rubber dolls and my teddy bear, who slept with me and whom I brought to America. One specially pleasant noise was heard maybe once a month when my father's string quartet came to play. As a preschooler, I and my friend Ursula were enrolled in a rhythmic exercise and dance class. Next slide. I was a skinny little kid with knock knees and dark hair cut short with bangs. This is my mother wearing a costume on the left, and I think this was taken at a photographer's studio. It's another picture of my mother. I remember peeking into my grandfather's bedroom where he was sick and lying in bed. He was a diabetic. In his day, there was no insulin, so he treated himself with a high protein diet. In 1925, he came down with pneumonia and died at the Mother House, a Catholic hospital. My mother got quite sick after my grandfather's death. She had been very much attached to her father, even though she always deplored the fact that he would not allow her to study medicine, but made her become a teacher. She taught for a while just before the First World War and hated it. In the 1920s, my grandparents had lost most of their fortune due to the devaluation of the currency. After my grandfather's death, my grandmother found herself in straitened circumstances. However, she owned the house and presumably received rent from my parents and her son Max, who had moved into the house with his family. Because of this, I acquired another playmate, my cousin Walter, who was 2.5 years younger than me. In 1927, Mr. Wagner decided to stop producing champagne in Trier, and my father lost his job. He decided to go into business for himself and opened an analytical laboratory in 2 rooms in our house. My mother's brother Max had been wounded at the front in World War I. He studied law, but never practiced as a lawyer. He made his living as a tax consultant and journalist. He married Gabriella Hegemann, a pretty brunette from a strict Catholic family. Max was accused by the Nazis of having worked as a traitor for the French occupation forces in Trier after World War I. While he was in prison, he urged Gabriella to divorce him for the sake of her own safety and that of their son Walter, which she did. When Max was released from prison in 1936, he came to see us. I remember seeing him, a pale, tall, bald man with frightened eyes, and I remember how strangely high his voice was. After the visit, he fled across the border into France, where he settled in Toulouse. When the Nazis came to France, Max fled on foot over the mountains to Spain, where he stayed in Barcelona for a time. After the war, he returned to Toulouse, where he found a second wife, a Jewish woman named Dreyfus. I did not go to the synagogue much. My parents felt that was for older children. Probably the only service I attended was Simchas Torah. The synagogue was destroyed by the Germans after the Crystal Night of 1938. The rabbi and his wife and daughter perished in Theresienstadt. Slide. Okay. I entered, okay, so I'm going to learn, let's see, I never went to kindergarten, but in 1927, when I was nearly 6 years old, at Easter time, I started school in the first grade. My mother walked me through town to the Protestant elementary school behind the cathedral, where one room had been set aside as the Jewish elementary school, grades 1 through 8. The teacher was Mr. Moses Berlinger. He would cane the naughty boys in front of the class and rap boys and girls over the knuckles with a ruler, if necessary. He had perhaps 35 to 40 children in his room. The first 4 grades held about 8 children each. In 5th grade, most children transferred to the secondary schools. The curriculum in 1st grade was concerned with teaching us to read and write with chalk on our breakable slate boards. We learned arithmetic and a little Hebrew and religion. When I entered school that spring day, I was very nervous. There were 3 other girls coming to 1st grade, Alice Goldstein, Rita Aaron, and Gertie Seinman, and 3 boys. By the way, Alice and her sisters, Miriam and Truda, were with us on our visit to Trier in 1984. Next slide. My mother said that when I was 10 years old, I was ready to transfer to the 5th grade at the girls' high school, the Augusta Victoria Schule. Okay, this is a little getting ahead. This is my grandmother, Lotte Herzberg, and this is her sister-in-law, Sophie Blumenthal Bell, in Oakland in 1939. So we're getting a little ahead because the text is still in Germany, but the photo I think was in Oakland. Anyway, Alice and Gertie transferred with me. It was a big step. We had to learn a foreign language, French. We sat in a class with about 25 Gentile girls. Most were Catholic, some were Lutheran. We Jewish girls had to come to school one afternoon a week when the chief rabbi, Dr. Altman, taught us about Judaism and the Bible. In our German classes, we had to write compositions, memorize poems, and learn grammar and reading. One teacher, Mr. Squakovius, was one of the first teachers to join the Nazi Party and to appear in his essay uniform at school. Another teacher, Mr. I, was an even greater Nazi. The following year, when I was in 6th grade, the teachers decided I should skip a grade. After summer vacation, I returned in the 7th grade. On January 30th, 1933, the Nationalist Socialist Party came to power and Hitler became the Chancellor of the Reich. The state became officially anti-Jewish. One of the earliest manifestations was the boycott against Jewish business establishments. Some Jews were arrested just for being Jewish. My father lost his accreditation at court as an expert technical witness, and I was allowed to continue in the public high school because my father had served at the front in World War I. Gradually, I was the only Jewish girl left in that school. The other Jewish students had to go back to the Jewish elementary school. The Nazi ideology made my classmates look at me to see whether I exhibited the typical inferior Jewish traits of hooked nose, thick lips, heavy eyelids, kinky hair, and dark coloring. I became isolated and ostracized in the classroom and during recess. After school, I had my Jewish friends. They were not appreciative of the fact that I was still a student in the high school. It made me something of an outsider in their group as well. They must have realized that my high school attendance was temporary while we made plans for immigration. While I was in high school, I attended the theater on student tickets until I was told that as a Jew, I was forbidden to do so. When my classmates went off to a 2-week labor camp with political indoctrination, I had a 2-week vacation. I attended 1 or 2 Nazi movies with my schoolmates. It was in these years that the Jewish youngsters formed their own club, the Jewish Youth League, which was neutral toward Zionism. A little later, I joined a Zionist youth group, Habonim. We had some discussions on the meaning of Jewishness, Jewish history, and also some co-ed hikes. I also learned some songs in Hebrew and Yiddish and was sufficiently motivated to take private lessons in Hebrew from Mr. Simon. By that time, I had hopes of going to Palestine, possibly with a youth aliyah, but it did not seem practical for my parents to go to Palestine. So in the end, I was persuaded to go to the US with my parents. My father had tried to go to Palestine. He wrote a letter to the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot about job opportunities as a chemist, but got a negative reply. People with money had an easier time emigrating from Germany to Palestine, especially since Palestine was the one place to which Germany permitted the legal transfer of Jewish funds from Germany. Alas, we had practically no money. My father's lab had gone downhill steadily since the Nazis came to power. In the end, he was probably lucky that he succeeded in selling it at all, even though it was for a very small amount. To get back to Habonim, I was persuaded to join by the Goldstein girls, who became active Zionists before I did. Later, I was the one to introduce Zionism to my second cousin, Marlis Brook from Bingen. And today she lives in Israel, a nurse at Kibbutz Mayan Tzvi, and her name is Marian Bachan. A number of my relatives did not leave Germany in time. My great aunt and uncle, Walter and Rika Izai, Emma Auerbach Landau, and Julie Auerbach Kahan, and her husband Bernard, all died in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. The Kahan's daughter Gita married Mr. Elikan in Strasbourg. They and their daughter Alice went to Lyon and were caught by the Nazis and died in a concentration camp. My great aunt, Stephanie Izai, the mother of Hilda Hubbock, took an overdose of medication to kill herself rather than be deported to an extermination camp by the Nazis. Amos A. Lung wrote that 100,000 Jews left Germany between 1933 and 1935. My mother wrote, it had taken some time for my parents to acknowledge the need to emigrate and then to find a place to go. The strain had been even worse for my father than my mother. Towards the end, he could not even sleep at night. He had written all over the world. In the end, the only chance was to accept the affidavit of support from Robert Bell, his nephew, and move to the US. This was in 1937. My family waited our turn at the American consulate in Stuttgart and got our American visa. We bought passage on a Dutch freighter. Then, shortly before the intended departure date, the freighter was involved in an accident and could not sail. We got an extension of the visa and were grateful to get passage on a German freighter, the SS Esta of the North German Lloyd Company, from Hamburg to San Francisco. Next slide. When our ship stopped at Antwerp in Belgium for a few hours, an elderly woman came to see us, Elfriede Koch, a niece of my grandfather Herzberg. This is a picture of a china cabinet which my great-grandmother sent to my mother and her parents when they lived in San Francisco. And it still stands in what was my parents' house in San Diego, which is now owned by my sister. Anyway, Elfrida Koch was a niece of my grandfather Herzberg. Once we started our journey to America, we enjoyed it. Even my father relaxed on the leisurely boat trip. Our ship had only 14 passengers and no doctor on board. I practiced English with two children who were on the voyage. We went through the Panama Canal and stopped at Cartagena, Colombia, as well as in El Salvador and Costa Rica. When we left the ship in San Francisco in late October 1937, a social worker for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, met us at the dock and lent my parents $50. My Uncle Ferdinand and Aunt Sophie also met us and took us to their little bungalow in East Oakland, where we stayed with them. But shortly thereafter, my parents went to San Francisco, leaving me a boarder with the Blumenthals. We paid an itemized bill for my room and board. Their means were limited. Ours were almost non-existent. My father worked at a small commercial laboratory for a few weeks. Briefly, he worked for Schilling, but his English was inadequate. After a while, he found a job at Langendorf Bakeries and remained their wine chemist until the day he died. The lab was at 1600 McAllister Street near Fillmore in San Francisco, in a heavily Jewish district with Jewish and Hebrew signs on store windows. My father's pay was low. My mother worked as a cleaning woman and a babysitter and gave a few lessons in German. I entered high school in Oakland. It was co-ed, which was new to me. The students seemed friendly, noisy, and very grown up. Small talk overwhelmed me. On the weekends, I visited my parents in San Francisco. My relatives in Oakland were not in good health and were not very pleasant to be around. My uncle would not allow any German to be spoken or read in his home. When my parents found half of a furnished flat at 1775 Turk Street near Divisadero in San Francisco, I moved in with them. We had 2 rooms and a kitchen and shared the bathroom with a landlady. My mother's cousins from Germany, Paul and Hannah Meyer, lived in the same building, and we sometimes had dinner with them. I had to change schools and enrolled in girls' high school in San Francisco and graduated in June 1938. I made a couple of friends there and recall a few good teachers. To me, it was fascinating that this school was racially mixed. I made friends with a Black girl and a Japanese girl. In the fall of 1938, I started San Francisco Junior College. I was torn between studying art and chemistry, but settled for the latter because I did not feel I had major talent for art. While at junior college, my physics teacher encouraged me to apply for a scholarship at the University of California at Berkeley and wrote a letter of recommendation for me. As a non-citizen, I would have had to pay about $175 in non-resident fees at UC. Slide. In 1939, my parents moved to 25 Cabrillo Street in San Francisco, a roomy flat which they furnished with furniture sent over from Germany by my grandmother. This is my mother in San Francisco in 1940. That in 1940, my mother's grandmother left Trier and moved to Luxembourg. Later, she moved to Toulouse, France, where her son lived. She died there in 1940. Next slide. After 3 semesters at junior college, I transferred to Berkeley. At first, I commuted to Berkeley by train. And this is again getting a little ahead. That's my parents' wedding picture from September 8th, 1946. Okay. Okay. I remember studying for my bacteriology final when the radio announced that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. By then I was living in a boarding house in Berkeley. Unfortunately, after the US went to war with Germany, we were declared enemy aliens and restricted in our movements. If I wanted to see my parents, I could no longer live in Berkeley, so I moved back into my parents' apartment in San Francisco and commuted to UC for my last undergraduate semester. My fellow students and my classes were mostly male. I made some friends at Cal and joined the student affiliate of the American Chemical Society, and I went on field trips with them. During the summers, I went on a couple of trips in the High Sierra with the Sierra Club. I graduated with a BS cum laude in chemistry in June 1942. Since my parents could not attend my graduation because they were enemy aliens, I decided to skip the ceremony. In 1943, the curfew for enemy aliens was lifted. We got our cameras back from our landlord and could go out at night again. After I graduated from Berkeley, I sent out letters and phone calls to some 60 places in the Bay Area in an attempt to find a job as a chemist. About that time, my father suffered a heart attack. He recuperated at home in bed for a couple of weeks. For part of that time, I substituted for him at his job as a chemist for Langendorf Bakeries. Before that, I worked in a physiology lab at Stanford Medical School in San Francisco. After my father returned to work, I landed a job at Mount Zion Hospital for $125 a month. I went to a few USO dances at the 14th Avenue Synagogue, which were for young single Jewish women and single Jewish soldiers. I applied to graduate school in chemistry and was accepted in PhD programs at Iowa State and Berkeley. I chose Berkeley. At Berkeley, I had to take a few courses in math and physics, and I was going to be a teaching assistant in chemistry. While I was a graduate student living in Berkeley, I had my first American boyfriend for a few weeks, a Jewish sailor in the Seabees. And I shared my apartment in Berkeley with a graduate student who, after a while, moved out. This was my first attempt at housekeeping and cooking. I discovered bean sprouts in the market on Telegraph Avenue. My professor didn't like girls as chemists and was not very fond of Jews. I had stack privileges at the main library on campus and attended a weekly research conference in the chemistry department. On June 4th, 1944, I had to take my orals for the PhD. I was nervous, of course, but everyone was elated by the news of the invasion of Normandy. On November 12th, 1944, my father and I attended the annual dinner dance of the American Chemical Society at the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley. My father was too tired to dance with me, but afterwards he and I returned by train and streetcar to 25 Cabrillo Street in San Francisco, where I was going to spend the weekend with my parents. As soon as my father retired, he felt ill. We called Dr. Nussenfeld. When he came over in a half hour or so, he gave my father a shot, but it was too late. My father died. My father was buried with the help of Rabbi Saul White on Monday. I gave up my apartment in Berkeley and moved back in with my mother. Shortly after my father's death, she discovered that she was suffering from diabetes and glaucoma. She got a job as a clerk for a wholesale dry goods firm. When she lost that job, she worked as a file clerk at the White House department store, a job she liked very much until she lost that job too. In the winter of 1944-45, I felt I had to support my mother now, so I decided to cut short my graduate studies. For the work I had done, Cal was willing to give me a master's instead of a PhD. I got a job at Effie Booth in Emeryville in their research lab. When I was working there, President Roosevelt died, which stunned everyone. On VE Day, Victory in Europe, Market Street was in a frenzy. A friend of mine attended a USO dance in San Francisco and gave her name and address to a Jewish serviceman. He in turn gave that information to a lonesome Jewish soldier in Hawaii, who then sent a letter to my friend. By the time it arrived, my friend had left San Francisco to marry an army doctor. So her mother passed the letter to me and suggested I correspond with the soldier in Hawaii. I did, and became acquainted with Isidore Henry Schwartz from San Diego. Therefore, I had a personal experience of great significance. Henry Schwartz returned from overseas and came to see me. He was still in his sergeant's uniform, but he was not alone. He had with him his mother and his Aunt Sophie from San Diego. We had room for all of them in our apartment on Cabrillo Street. Henry took me out for a date at the Fairmont Hotel. We talked and talked over a big exotic drink. Later, he said he talked so much because he was nervous. I thought he was great. He was going to San Diego with his mother, but he was going to come back to the Bay Area and get his degree in journalism at UC Berkeley. He did return and rented a room near us and took his dinners with us while he commuted to UC Berkeley. That winter, Henry and I went on a skiing weekend at the Sierra Club Lodge in Soda Springs. We rented skis and traveled by train and had a lovely time. Henry found part-time work as a copy boy at the San Francisco Chronicle. In the spring, we became engaged and made plans for an August wedding. In July, Henry went home to San Diego for a visit. A few days after he left, I received a call. His brother Joe had just died. Joe had gone to the hospital the day before and had died very quickly. Apparently, he had emphysema. This is Joan speaking, and according to an old letter, my uncle actually died of a punctured lung from swallowing a fishbone. My mother wrote, I caught a flight to San Diego. Daddy and Grandma were badly shocked. Grandma was in a state of collapse. After the funeral, she sat in her hot, low-ceilinged little room and received callers, among them her sister and brother-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Kirschbaum. We decided to postpone the wedding to September and to scale down our modest plans for the reception still further. So on September 8th, 1946, we got married at the 14th Avenue Synagogue in San Francisco. Rabbi White officiated. I wore a pale green two-piece dress. Henry wore a blue suit. His mother and aunt had come to town for the wedding and were staying with us. Among the wedding guests were Paul and Hannah Meyer, our cousins from Germany. Of the rabbi's sermon, I do not remember one word, but I recall that Henry stepped on the traditional glass to break it. Afterwards, we had a turkey dinner with champagne and a pretty wedding cake. Henry and I went to a hotel near Van Ness Avenue. The next morning, we took the train to Carmel, where we spent 2 or 3 days. Since her son's death, my mother-in-law seemed to be unable to take care of her affairs. She owned some apartment buildings in San Diego. So Henry had to live in San Diego to help her. For one thing, she couldn't even read and write. She could barely sign her name and read simple numbers. So we moved to San Diego. For the first 2 weeks, we lived in my mother-in-law's 2-bedroom bungalow. Even before we were married, when I was in San Diego for the funeral in July, Henry had arranged for me to have a job interview with Dr. Hepner, the president of San Diego State College. So I was welcome as a lab instructor. I taught either 4 or 6 freshman chemistry labs a week. In 1947, my mother lost her job. As a file clerk, we invited her to come to San Diego, where she moved in with us. Next slide. In the fall of 1947, I discovered that I was pregnant. My mother-in-law had bought us a house. That's my mother with me as a baby, and that's the house that I lived in from birth until I was in 5th grade. But that's where my parents moved in 1948 on New Jersey Street in San Diego. And they moved in early 1948. My mother wrote, I worked until the day before Joan was born. On Wednesday, the 7th of April, my waters broke. I called the doctor and he told me to get over to the hospital. Henry was at work in Encinitas, where he was a printer's apprentice. So we called a cab and my mother went over to Mercy Hospital with me. At 10 p.m. that evening, Joan was born. The pediatrician, Dr. Malin, assured me that Joan was a fine, healthy baby, small but not premature. She was a healthy baby, noisy, lively, a small eater, dainty, the doctor called her. I returned home, but did not return to work until the fall. Joan became the center of attention in our house. Typically, I was reluctant to let anyone else handle her except my mother, who was a fine and devoted baby nurse. We went overboard on sterilizing bottles, boiling diapers, preventing drafts, and keeping quiet when the baby was asleep. Next slide. Now I'm speaking as Joan. My grandmother Oma lived with my parents until she died in 1975. My father died at the age of 70 in 1991. After working at San Diego State College, my mother worked as a lab technician at Mercy Hospital and later taught chemistry at 2 junior colleges and a university in San Diego. My father owned and operated a small printing company and later became a real estate agent, commercial property owner, and author. My sister Debbie was born in 1951. My sister Amy was born in 1954. And my sister Becky was born in 1960. My mother and grandmother received reparations payments from the German government. My mother got this because her education was interrupted, and my grandmother got it because her family home in Trier was sold for much less than it was worth. Slide, if there's any more. It's another picture. Yeah, this is again me and my mom and the house on New Jersey Street. This is a picture of my 2 grandmothers at Knott's Ferry Farm. There's my with men who were part of the bench. They were both widows. So on the left is my grandmother, Lotte Herzberg, and on the right is my father's mother, Jenny Friedman Schwartz. And I really like this picture, which I think my mother took. Okay, now I'm going to talk about my own experience in my family. Next slide. In 1984, my parents and 4 of my mother's childhood friends and the daughter of one of her friends visited Trier for the town's 2000th anniversary. So this is with me and my mother standing in our driveway in our bathing suits on the New Jersey Street house when I was a little kid. And there's me with both my parents, Eva and Henry, also at the New Jersey Street house. And at that point, I was an only child. It was around 1950 that I was born. Next slide. That's a picture of my parents in San Francisco, and I think it was in the 1980s. And you can see the Muni bus in the background. And when my son saw this picture, he could tell when it was taken by the grill of the car in the picture. Okay, so let's see, is there a next slide in this series? Yeah, this is a picture of my mother and her 4 daughters and some of her grandchildren. My sister Amy is at the left. She lives in New York and writes and illustrates children's books. There's my mother. There's me. There's my sister Debbie, who lives in Signal Hill, who worked on a career becoming an opera singer and then wound up working for Boeing. And there's my sister Becky with her 2 older kids. The baby is her daughter Jenna, and also her son Dylan, and Becky's an obstetrician and gynecologist. Next slide. This is taken on the driveway of my mother's home in San Diego. This is my mother's son-in-law, Leonard Marcus, and his son, Jacob. And between them is my son, Josh. And Josh is holding on to his cousin, Dylan Martinez. And my mother's holding her granddaughter, Jenna Martinez. And later, after many years later, my mother got a 5th grandchild, Bryce Martinez, in addition to this one. Let's see, is there another slide in this series? I'm not sure. Yeah, this is a poster for the 2000th anniversary of Trier. It says 2000 Jahre Stadt Trier, 2000 years of Trier, and this was its name in Latin, Augusta Treverorum. 1984, Deutschland's älteste Stadt, Germany's oldest city. So I'm going to talk about the visit to Germany. Is there another slide in this series? I'm not sure. There's another series. This is a picture of Trier from the Mosel River. So there's obviously a bridge across the river. So it's a very pretty place. A lot of tourists like going there. And then is there another one in this series or not? Yeah, this is when we were in Trier, there were Englishmen dressed as Roman soldiers parading around the town to help celebrate the 2000th anniversary. And this is an Englishman dressed as a Roman soldier in a museum looking at a bust of a Roman. And in the background, in the light tan coat, is my mother. And next to her is the daughter of one of her friends she grew up with in Trier. Okay, so is there another slide with this one? This one I'll talk about also. This is a book that my sister Amy wrote called Oma and Bobo, which is named after our grandmother and our dog. And it's actually a true story. And in the background is a house, which is like the first house we lived in on New Jersey Street. And you can see Bobo's tail in the panel on the left. And my mother was the model for Amy drawing Oma. And here's the same china cabinet that was sent to San Francisco by my great grandmother from Germany, which is now in San Diego. And there's someone representing us girls carrying Bobo in that picture. And this is an article about, I'm jumping ahead. I at one point led a group for descendants of German Jewish Holocaust survivors from Austria and Germany. And the reason I did this is that a woman approached me and said she had been in a group for children of survivors, and that some of the people in the group were children of families from Eastern Europe, and they weren't very nice to her. So she asked me to lead this group, even though I had been in a group at Jewish Family Service, and I didn't feel that I was mistreated at all by people whose families were from Eastern Europe. But it was nice to get a write-up. But in fact, I also led a group at the JCC, and I got involved in an organization called Generation to Generation in 1979 and led some groups for them. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about, and this is a picture we're going on. I love this picture. This is in our bedroom on New Jersey Street. I'm the girl on the right who's about 7 years old. And I shared a room with those 2 sisters. Debbie is about 3.5, the one in the middle. And the one on the left is my sister, Amy. And it wasn't until we moved to another house that we got another sister. So it was pretty crowded with 2 twin beds and a crib in the same room, but we made it through. But I like that picture a lot. Okay, so this is the books that I used as resources for this talk. And one of them I haven't actually mentioned yet, but this is The Pity of It All is written by Amos Ceylon, and it's a history of famous Jewish men from Germany. It ends in 1933. So it's kind of dry, and I wish they'd talk more about women and regular people. And this other book is a book that I like called Children of the Holocaust, Conversations with Sons and Daughters of Survivors by Helen Epstein, which was published in 1979. Helen Epstein is the daughter of two Czech Jewish concentration camp survivors who knew each other a little bit before the war, but who married after the war. And she was born in Prague. And then later, when the Soviets started to take over Czechoslovakia, her parents decided to move to New York. And so this was one of the very first books about children of survivors that were written, and she interviewed a number of children of survivors. Interestingly enough, she gave a pseudonym to one of the people she interviewed. The pseudonym was Deborah Schwartz, which turns out to be my sister's actual name. And she quotes a psychiatrist and one of the women of survivors. So I'm going to look and see quickly if here it says, in her 1979 book, Children of the Holocaust, Helen Epstein described the transmission of trauma symptoms from concentration camp survivors to their children. She quoted one woman who said her survivor parents always perceive the worst possible outcome for things. She also quoted a psychiatrist who had treated survivors and their children who said, these parents are excessively protective, constantly warning children of impending danger. The survivor's child learns depression as a primary response to stress of any kind. I was going to talk about what happened. People passed away. My father's mother died in 1959. My mother's mother died in 1975. My father died in 1991. And my mother died in 2015. This is a picture taken in early August 1990 in New York. And my sister Amy is on the right. And there's my mother, my father, and my son Josh. We were in New York for the occasion of Amy's wedding to Leonard Marcus. And so all looked very happy at that point. And I think we were probably in Central Park when it was taken. So next slide. These are all slides from our visit to Germany in 1984. And in the background, you can see the Englishmen dressed as Roman soldiers with their helmets on. And I think this was a cathedral that this was in the background. And so there's a number of photos that I took on that occasion. And I was very glad that I was able to do that. This is another picture from the trip to Trier in 1984, again with the people pretending to be Roman soldiers, but it was fun to do that. This was also in Trier, and I think this is when my mother and her friends went back to their high school to get a copy of their grades from the 1930s, and they got copies of it. When she was there, some old family friends invited my mother to visit them, and then they canceled it. And she said she thought it was because she was Jewish. She did show me the outside of the house where she lived in Trier. And she said, gee, wouldn't it be funny if I died here? Then I would have made full circle. And when I was there, I asked her, why, when you came to the United States, why didn't you just take a plane? And she said, oh no, there were no commercial flights in those days. But this was her second trip back to Trier. She'd made an earlier trip in 1969. And at that point, I was in Berkeley taking art classes at the California School of Arts and Crafts. And my mother asked me to go, and I said yes. And she bought tickets for my father and me and my sister. And then I decided I didn't want to go and told my mother, and she was very upset about this and came to Berkeley to try to persuade me not to go. And I insisted on not going. And I think I was trying to separate and individuate from my mom, but I now feel bad that I hurt her feelings, and I'm glad that I did get to go there in 1984 with them. So next slide, and I think there's a few more. Those are my parents together also, I think, in Trier. And this was also in Trier too. I think this is part of a Roman ruin, maybe a bath. Um, and this is also in Trier. I think this woman on the right is Taya, one of the 4 childhood friends who were with us on this trip. It looks yummy ice, and this is a windmill. And my parents also are in the lower left-hand corner. We went for walks in the countryside around Trier. Next slide. So this is the group that all were Jewish women who grew up in Trier. I don't know who this guy is, but there's Taya, my mother, um, Miriam Goldstein, Alice Goldstein, and Trude Goldstein. They're all married, and all 5 of them lived in the United States. And Miriam and Alice lived in San Francisco for many years. Next slide. Oh, and this is the current synagogue. As I said, the other synagogue was burned down, but there is one synagogue in Trier, and this is the current, was the synagogue in 1984 when we were there. Next slide, if there is one. And again, here are the friends from who grew up together in Trier in the 20s and 30s. And I think they're all very happy to be together and to be in their old town. There was nostalgia for the pre-Nazi days. And this is also in Trier in a market square in the center of town. And I think the street my mother lived on was pretty close to the center of town. And next slide, there's another one. Not sure how many there are. Yeah, this is also the Mosel River with a bridge. It's very pretty there. And there's boat traffic on it. Next slide. This is the Porta Nigra, famous Roman ruin. Next slide. And this is also a building there. I'm not sure if this might have been the house my mother lived in. I'm not quite sure, but it is the 3rd floor where they lived. This is my mother standing on a street, maybe that street in Trier before the building. I think it was the building where they had lived before. They didn't have a car when they lived there. And then this is again the parades. I think this is the central cathedral in the sort of downtown area in Trier. Next slide. And this is my mother. This is again in New York with my mother, my dad, my son, and my sister. Next slide. Okay, and this is also a church in Trier. Trier has a tradition that they have a shirt that Christ wore on the cross. And it's shown every 100 years, and it was shown when I was there, so I got to see it under glass. Is there another slide, or is that the last one?
That's the last one.
Okay. There's a whole other part I haven't gotten to, which has to do with what it was like for me to grow up in my family, but I want to stop. Do people want to have a discussion now, or do you want me to go into that portion of the talk? Do people have any preference on what to do with the rest of our time? I don't see anything in the chat. I'll go on with it unless I hear. Anyway, okay, I was affected by my mother and grandmother's experiences of trauma. So I guess you can just show me on the screen. Even though I was living in a different time and place, when I was a young girl, my family went on a day trip to Tijuana. And my mother and grandmother anxiously got their naturalization papers so they could re-enter the US. I think I sensed their anxiety because when we were crossing the border to return to the US, I announced to the border guard that I'd been born in Germany, which was not true. This caused a great deal of consternation in my family, but we were able to return to San Diego. When I was 10 years old, my family moved from our old neighborhood to another neighborhood in San Diego where some of their friends lived. I had been the only Jewish student in my first elementary school until my sister entered kindergarten there. I was very upset about the move and about the prospect of making new friends there. I hid under lunch tables during lunch recess at my new school for a while when I first arrived. At one point, my mother told me I had to visit 3 houses in our new neighborhood where children my age lived. I was scared about doing this, but I did it. Although this was a very minor move compared to my mother's move from Germany to the US at the age of 16, I wonder if this was my way of experiencing what I thought my mother's move was like. My sister had dreams about the Nazis coming to get her around the time we moved. I had dreams of our new house blowing down in a windstorm and moving back to our old house. In my family, there was a strong emphasis on doing well in school and having a professional career. At times, my mother was depressed and anxious and had catastrophic thinking. She was very critical of herself and others. When I was in junior high school, I had to do a science project. My mother brought me Petri dishes of E. coli and intestinal bacteria that I'd not requested. When I was reluctant to work on the project, she said, "Do you want to work in a dime store?" When we were interviewed for a student exchange program with Mexican families, she said, "What will happen if Joan breaks her arm in Mexico?" When I was not accepted into the program, I felt mad at my mother. However, when I was 18, my parents let me and my best friend go to Mexico City by ourselves for 2 months in the summer to study Spanish. When I had my first date in 10th grade, my mother told me about a girl in a Jewish family they knew who had gotten pregnant as a teenager. When I was a teenager, my mother said, "I hope at least one of my daughters gets married." When my parents visited the first house I bought, my parents came from San Diego to see it. My mother said, "I guess the garage is a total loss." My sister trained to become an opera singer. When she called her mother to tell her that she'd gotten a contract with the Metropolitan Opera, my mother said, "How is your social life?" My mother had some sayings that nobody else around me had, such as, "Let's be off," like so many buttons. "My children have elbows like other people have knives." And when we did something she really disliked, she said, "Another nail in my coffin." I internalized my mother's opinions and fears, particularly about me, and felt I had to be academically and professionally successful. My mother was a good role model in that she had a professional career and a family. Um, in 1979, and some of this I said before, I joined a group for adult Holocaust, children of Holocaust survivors, generation to generation, and attended a group for children of survivors at Jewish Family Services. Okay. I believe my involvement in generation to generation and in leading groups for children of survivors was my way of working out my issues with my family and of helping others. And that is enough. I've talked a lot. So I'd like to see if people have some questions.
Maybe Judy Kanofsky would like to ask her question.
Okay, go Judy.
Did your family speak German in the US?
Yeah, I heard German every day because her mother lived with us and she and her mother spoke in German. But my father only spoke English. And I believe that his mother spoke Yiddish, although I never heard her speak Yiddish. His mother was born near a city called Lemberg, which is now Lvov or Lviv and is in the Western Ukraine, but it was part of Austria-Hungary when she lived there. And between the wars, I think it was part of Poland.
But did your father, could he speak German but just refused to, or he didn't speak
He
German?
he didn't know any German.
Okay.
So the secrets were in German. So I took German for 3 years in high school and 1 year in college, but I've forgotten most of it. And when we went to a department store in Trier, my mother and I, we were there, and there was a sales lady and she said something in German. And my mother said, "Meine Tochter spricht kein Deutsch," which is my daughter doesn't speak German, which I understood. But they had various friends at Seder's. They had Haggadot that were in German and Hebrew, and other ones that were in English and Hebrew. And we had some German food, and
Did they talk about Yiddish? I mean, because many German speakers, including German Jews, disparaged Yiddish, and I'm wondering if that was in your mother's family as well.
They didn't talk about it, but my parents had a mixed marriage. My father's family was from Eastern Europe, even though he was born in San Diego.
Right.
But his father was born in Romania and his mother near Lemberg. So it was just that we were all Jewish. We didn't get into criticizing people from a different place.
I see. Okay.
I have a question.
Hi, Claudia.
Hi. So your mother spoke German and Yiddish in
No,
Germany?
she didn't speak Yiddish. She just spoke English and German.
Oh, okay. So did she learn Yiddish?
No.
No, never.
No. And I often wonder because sometimes my parents would go out and both my grandmothers would babysit us. One lived with us and the other lived half a block away. And I often wondered, did they speak in German and Yiddish or did they speak in English? I can't remember.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Joan,
my,
I have a question.
yeah,
Um, what happened to the Jews of this town that did not get to go anywhere? Where did they end up being taken, or what was
our
was the
relatives.
yeah?
Well, as I mentioned, a number of them died in concentration camps.
Mhm.
Right, but
Some
I
of them
mean,
went to
just
France and they were picked up there and also deported to concentration camps, except for my great uncle Max, who survived by going to Spain and only coming back to France after the war was over.
was that town because of the geographical location of it in the south. I kind of understand that Jews from different parts of Germany were taken to different camps because the camps were, scattered kind of everywhere. And I just wondered if there was a camp that the Jews who are not your relatives from that town, that region, were apportioned to.
Not that I know of. I don't know of any concentration camps
You
near
mentioned
there. But
Theresienstadt.
what?
You mentioned Theresienstadt.
Yeah, that is in Czechoslovakia, and a number of my relatives died there.
Hmm.
And I don't know why they didn't leave, if they were in denial or they didn't have the money or they didn't have a visa. My mother doesn't explain why they didn't leave. And also when I was growing up in San Diego, in fact, my mother never verbally told me that any of her relatives died in concentration camps. I found out by reading her autobiography, and I went to a movie in New York with the cousin Hilda Hubbock in like 1971. And we went to a movie about the Jews in Czechoslovakia and what happened to them when the Nazis took over. And she said, yes, my mother took poison when they came to get her.
And was that the first you heard of that?
Yes.
So it sounds like your family didn't, I mean, like I always kind of have observed that there's sort of two versions of Holocaust survivor families, the kind that never talk about it and the kind that always talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's true. When I led groups, I mean, they talked a lot about a lot of nostalgia, particularly my grandmother, about the good old days in Trier.
Wow.
And I knew that there were Nazis and they were bad guys, and that's why they left and they survived. But the goriest parts of it, the people who were murdered, they didn't tell us. And certainly as a little kid, I think I just would have been frightened by it. But it's interesting. I gave this talk once before, and two of my sisters were part of the participants. And that's when one of them told me for the first time that she had these nightmares about the Nazis coming to get her. So somehow it leaked through. They kept in touch with a lot of friends and family from there. I and my parents at different times visited her cousin Walter in France. We visited the kibbutz in Israel that her cousin helped found, which is near Zirkon Yaakov. And my grandmother visited friends in Portland, Oregon. I think she took trains up, and her cousins in Sausalito. And I think it was a lot easier for my mother to become Americanized because she came here when she was much younger. She went to school, she had American friends, she married an American Jewish man. Whereas for her parents, they didn't really integrate that much with outside their community.
That's such an interesting thing, though, that you had both your grandmothers from this whole other generation, and they didn't. That wasn't the big topic, or at least it was suppressed. It sounds like a lot of.
When I was within earshot, it wasn't discussed. I don't know what was discussed when I wasn't.
If you don't mind me jumping in a little bit, my mom left Austria at the age of 11, about a week after Kristallnacht. So they actually did come into her bedroom and pointed to her. And then somebody said she has a cold. So the Nazis left, and then she ended up being able to go to New York And my
Unbelievable.
uncle went to Argentina. My other great aunt went to Paris, and
Mm.
um, Argentina, Paris, and my grandmother, my mother's mother, went to Shanghai for 10 years.
Wow.
So,
I heard there were a lot of German Jews there. Yeah.
right, it was a
Really?
community. And then 10 years later, she was able to reunite with my mother in New York.
Oh, that's
But
great.
the main focus of my mother's entire life is when she was 11 and she had to leave because she was a very, entitled uh, child in Vienna. They owned lumber yards and, everything. And all of a sudden she was on a ship going to a foreign country. So I'll go into my story more one day too.
Well, one of the things which is true for many immigrants is loss of socioeconomic status. I mean, in Germany, my mother's grandfather was a doctor. They owned the house that they lived in. I didn't put it in, but she visited Belgium with her mother and grandmother. The cousin that married Albert Schweitzer, they had arrived and they got here and they were kind of nobody. They didn't have money. The parents didn't speak English. My grandmother told me a story when they got here, was just before an election, which I guess was in November of 1937. And somebody came up to my grandmother and gave her some campaign literature. And she knew a little English. And she said, I am strange. And she knew later that that sounded weird, but she didn't know how to say stranger, like ich bin fremd
Oh,
in German.
wow.
And she later realized it was funny, but at the time, that's all she could say about that. There was one time when I was 15 where I visited San Francisco with my grandmother and my sister. And there was something I was going to say about that, but I forgot. We did visit her cousins in Sausalito, and we went to look for my grandfather's grave in Colma, which I think she found. But she went into a department store in downtown San Francisco and immediately struck up a conversation in German with the lady at the sales counter, which I was heard of. In San Diego, there were very few people who spoke German. My parents were friends with a couple who was Jewish, and the man was from San Diego and the woman was Jewish from Germany. And they were very close friends with them for throughout their lives.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So how many years did it take for your mother to learn English and find her first job? Since she was highly educated already, she got a pretty good job from the beginning, right?
She was lab assistants. I mean,
Lab assistant.
she was
Mhm.
just thrown in her last year of high school, because remember, she had skipped a grade. So she
Mhm.
was a year younger than most high school seniors. And so she went and she got here in October of 1937. And by June of 1938, she graduated from high school. And that fall, she started junior college.
And she gained her English language
school.
ability that quickly.
Yeah, and then she went for 3 semesters to junior college and then transferred to Cal and graduated there 4 years later with a BA
It's
in
amazing.
chemistry and got some jobs working in labs. And for a while as I said, took over her father's job when he was ill. And then she went to graduate school. She was in a PhD program at Cal in chemistry in the 40s. And I think only one of 2 women in her class. But after her father died, she dropped out to work to support herself and her mother and got a master's degree. And she later taught college chemistry.
I'm amazed that she learned English language so quickly. I
Yeah.
guess the minds were fairly
Well, I think it's easier for a 16-year-old than
16-year-old, right?
her parents are much older. Her father was 10 years older than her mother. So they were definitely middle-aged when they arrived.
Mhm.
Much less, as I said, integrated into the community. They also told me a story when they were in San Francisco. They wanted to go to high holiday services, but they were like new immigrants and had very little money. So there were services given by Temple Emmanuel, but they had to sit outside, like on folding chairs, and listen over a loudspeaker. You know, so but it worked out for them, and I wouldn't exist, as Lorelei pointed out, if she hadn't survived. So in some ways, she had it a lot easier than people who were in hiding or in camp, who lost parents, siblings, grandparents, even though her uncle was in prison to do that. But the other part is individual differences. Everybody who goes through the same trauma doesn't have the same way of handling it.
Right.
So she handled it. She had a lot of family support, which was helpful. But so I don't know if, for instance, when she later became pretty anxious and depressed, how much was related to her experiences living in Nazi Germany and how much she due to other factors. But she did always seem to be really afraid of the police in San Diego. And as a kid, I mean, maybe she knew more than I did. I always thought she was overreacting. But there was one day where she got a subpoena, and there was something in our family said that she had like backed into a police car, and she was really upset. And I thought she was really overdoing it. And then later in life, I got a subpoena and totally fell apart myself, called my mother. Mine was about child custody and my possibly losing custody of my son. So I was more sympathetic to her about how she responded to the subpoena of doing that. So, well, I appreciate all your questions and all your interest. And I'm obviously not the only person around here who's had a parent who lived in Europe during the Nazi era.
That's probably what attracted all us to come to this talk.
Did your family live in Europe during the Nazi period? Or?
My mother's family left Poland in 1935, and it was kind of a fluke that caused them to leave, because my grandfather was in South Africa and always trying to lure them to come there, and they didn't want to. And then some little incident happened, and suddenly my grandmother was willing. But I'm just very struck by the auspiciousness of the years, like yours were 1937, right? It just, you know, so they just got in through the crack. And my mother, 1935, they were so blessed. They just got spared.
Yeah.
Also, I think it was in some ways easier for German Jews because it came gradually. And so they had more years to prepare and to face the reality. Many of them were educated. Some of them had more money, as opposed to some Jews in Eastern Europe, where they said it can't happen here. And then all of a sudden in 1939, Germany invaded Poland on September 1st. And they had less money, less education. And so I think maybe that's some of the resentment toward German Jews. I didn't realize till I went to Israel about resentment toward German Jews. They're called yeka, which means jacket. And it's like they think they're better than us. They have these fancy jackets. They actually have a newspaper there in German for German Jews, which I'd never seen here. I don't know if it's in New York too, but there was a lot of resentment toward them from other people who immigrated to Israel. Like my grandfather expected to have a professional job when he wanted to move there, and when it didn't happen. But it was easier for young people to go than it was for people her parents' age.
Yeah. Joan, did your parents drink tea with their pinkies up? That was a stereotype among the people I knew, that's what the Yekas do. They drink tea like that.
Do you think it was different on the East Coast, where there was more grouping of the German Jews over here and the Eastern European Jews over there?
Well, there were German Jews in New York, but not in my part of town.
So, well, one thing here is a lot of synagogues are for a particular group. Like in San Francisco, Shereth Israel was for Eastern European Jews, and Temple Emmanuel was formed by wealthy Jews from Bavaria who came to San Francisco in the middle of the 19th century and became, you know, Levi Strauss and the Fleischhackers and the Zellerbachs. And so when people think German Jewish and rich, my family isn't like that. They were a later form of immigration. Another thing that's interesting in my family, my mother's family, were the professionals. Like I have a PhD, my sister has an MD, my mother has a master's degree, her father was a chemist, but they had very little money. Whereas my father's family was from Eastern Europe. They had very little education. My grandmother couldn't read or write. They had the money. I get
Well, then
money
it was a
today
perfect
through
marriage.
investments. They knew how to do.
I come
My
from a
father's father was
Jewish
a
family.
pawnbroker in San Diego. So
One thing we know about the Yekis from Israel and from everywhere is that they're always on time. That's
I was first called a Yeki in about 1995, 94.
oh, you are one of us. Sort of.
At least on my father's side, I'm definitely a Yeki, and my surname Dembitz is a Yeki surname, although actually it's a Polish place name. But
The kibbutz that my mother's cousin co-founded, Mayon Zvi, was founded by German Jews. And there were sometimes in Israel where I speak a little more German than he. I speak very little Hebrew, where I had to use what little German I knew, which was better than nothing. Sometimes I could use Spanish too with some people, but not my family.
my father's parents met at a Reform temple in Washington, D.C. And I think the Reform temples were started by the German Jews. And that's where they went. But my German ancestors came over long before, I mean, in the 19th century.
Oh,
And,
to here, to Northern California? Or?
no, to DC, to the East
Oh.
Coast. I'm the immigrant to the West Coast.
that was the first Aliyah of the German, the Western European and the German Jews, the 1820s, 1830s.
Yeah, the Dembitzes came in 1848.
Yeah.
And they managed to, I mean, my great-great-great-grandfather was a physician, and he continued to be a physician, and so generally they continue to be professionals. But my grandmother's family came from southern Germany because they were totally broken. Things were horrible in southern Germany, and my great-grandfather on that side was a horse trader.
Wow. Wow.
And my grandmother, that grandmother, got a degree and taught school. So, she raised herself up.
That's good to know. Yeah, we're all descendants of Jewish immigrants for sure. They're just different
Joan,
waves.
I have a question. So my family is Russian Jewish, but I wonder if you know much about German Jews previous to their generation migrating to Russia. Was that one place
I don't know about
You don't know.
there were some Jews.
During World War II, during World War II, some German Jews emigrated to Russia. I lived in Berlin in the first half of the 90s, and I met the descendants of a bunch of those people who had come back from Russia. They'd survived by immigrating to Russia and come back.
Right. Well, that's where my family is. But we have no knowledge of German ancestry, so I don't know.
There were some Jews living in Germany, even in Trier, whose families came from Eastern Europe, like these Goldstein sisters, they did. And they were called Ostjude, Eastern Jews. In other words, they hadn't been there for 300 years like my family. But I don't think there was discrimination. They went to the same schools and were in the same Zionist youth group. And also it's interesting, I was thinking about marrying non-Jews. Both my mother's uncle married a Catholic woman, and my father had a cousin he grew up with in San Diego who also married a non-Jewish woman. So it wasn't ruled out. And of my mother's 4 daughters, 2 of us married non-Jewish men. One married a Jewish man and one didn't get married. So, and my parents were just glad about the marriages. And my mother really wanted grandchildren, which she got.
Baruch Hashem. So Joan, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm going to be turning off the recording now because it's like an hour and a half long. And
Yeah.
it's a big
Thank you for
file.
all your help and putting up with me. It was complicated.